Good afternoon, and thank you for giving up another lunchtime and coming to a series of global talks. The one today, I think, is really interesting. It's the one we've got on creating living cities across the globe, and with speakers from Wales, Denmark, and Singapore. Thank you for attending, but what I'd like to do is introduce David Thorpe to start with. He's our first speaker. He's the director of the One Planet Centre in Wales. He's written a shed load of really interesting books on sustainability and how we should live in a green planet, and has also had a career as a Marvel comic writer and science fiction writer that I find equally as interesting. So I'm going to pass you over now, over to David.
Thank you very much, Robin. Well, good morning, good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you are in the world. Well, one thing we've learned during the pandemic, I think, is that we all want more living cities. We want more nature in cities. We want regenerative cities. In fact, we want regenerative everything. And the following two presentations will be about projects, but mine is more focused on principles and their applications. Now, lots of great eco projects are happening in cities and towns around the world, but how can we be sure that they are up to the ecological challenge and that their benefits are not cancelled out by other activities going on in the same location? Now, that to me is the huge challenge that we face. The Earth has only so many resources to go around, and we have to share them equally, not only amongst ourselves, but with all living things on the planet, for our sake and for theirs. But we've been living in ecological deficit for 50 years. We've been living off the future, living off our children's futures. And this is why we have climate and extinction emergencies. If you don't pay your bills, someone can come and take your house away. Well, we are losing nature, 60% gone in 50 years, and the rate of loss is accelerating. Now, science tells us that a fair distribution of resources would be equivalent to 2.5 times the size of a football pitch per person, assuming that area has global average land productivity. But developed countries consume more, and so they have more impact. I picture cities like huge vacuum cleaners hoovering up resources, nutrients from the soil in the form of food from all over the world. Instead of reclaiming and reusing these resources and nutrients, they're spewing them out as pollution in the air and waters, destroying our health and environment. Here in Wales, if everyone in the world were to consume the same as us, we would need almost 3 planet Earths. Now, this measurement of the ecological footprint was commissioned by the Welsh Government as part of its solution to the climate emergency. You're probably familiar with Kate Raworth's diagram, the donut metaphor. This safe space, which satisfies people's basic needs, as defined by the Sustainable Development Goals, demands that we use a level of resources defined by the pressures of planetary boundaries. It's crucial to keep in mind that there is nowhere in the world where the donut exists, i.e. where people are living well and genuinely sustainably. So we must achieve that goal or risk catastrophes. Achieving One Planet success is the goal of the One Planet Centre, of which I'm director. There are other organisations, of course, striving to help communities reach the same space, but not everything that is called One Planet is using the ecological footprint, planetary boundaries concept. In Wales, its leaders were wise enough to bring in a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in 2015. Other countries are learning from us. One of its aims is to reduce the ecological footprint of Wales to 1 planet. The ecological footprint captures much more than the carbon footprint. It's easy to communicate, but it can be difficult to capture data for. So we are developing ideas and learning from practice. Now, I personally take inspiration from a 10-year-old piece of planning legislation in Wales called One Planet Development. In principle, these developments can be located anywhere, but in practice, only so far have been located in the open countryside. The planning conditions on the right-hand side of this slide are extremely rigorous. They tie occupancy levels to the carrying capacity of the land. They give rise to beautiful, affordable, zero-carbon buildings and a significant increase in land productivity and biodiversity, and they provide jobs. I described how to do One Planet development in the book on the left, published in 2014. While in charge of the Sustainable Cities Collective website for global leaders, I began thinking about how we can apply these principles at city level. And the book on the right came out in 2019. I began teaching about it and trying to persuade cities to take up the simple 5-step process to get to One Planet success in the conclusion of this book. As with energy efficiency, what gets measured gets saved. The Welsh Government provides a calculator to help people in One Planet developments get to One Planet. It's freely available online, along with the planning guidance, and this is a screen grab from it. So I wondered why all planning approvals and public purchasing decisions don't come with similar requirements. It's the obvious way to avoid unwanted, unsustainable development. So we've been working to apply these principles in practice with a few projects. My nearest town is Swansea, and here with partners we're developing a solutions website for different audiences, which will be published soon with the help of its Environment Forum and the support of the Council. For the county as a whole, we came up with a One Planet local development strategy for Swansea Council's Rural Development Programme Local Action Group. They chose these 3 strategic aims, and each aim has objectives attached to it. These are all about building biodiversity and biocapacity, local short supply chains involving locals and visitors, and developing a distinctive local identity. The objectives target climate change with energy efficiency and renewable energy, and moving towards a circular economy. We're just starting on a new project to test these ideas in a larger area in Mid Wales, where we're collecting data to calculate the ecological footprint and the biocapacity. Much of this data is available publicly. Some will have to be collected on the ground. Our data expert uses algorithms to adapt this data relative to planetary boundaries. This will result in the ecological footprint. We will then involve all sectors of the population to set goals to reduce the footprint to the One Planet level over a specified period of time. Progress can then be measured periodically. This spring, we hope to launch a One Planet standard that will help organisations transform themselves to respect planet Earth's natural boundaries and capacities. We are working with an independent accreditation company, and there will be bronze, silver and gold levels. We ourselves offer training and tools. In summary, the method we recommend is that we should all set targets and measure progress over time. But it's extremely important, especially for cities, to capture all activities, including imports and exports, to avoid unwanted consequences. All decisions, whether on procurement or planning, can capture social and ecological value and build them into the balance sheet. The reason we have the climate and extinction emergencies is that they've been left off the balance sheet since the time of the Industrial Revolution. The Welsh Wellbeing Future Generations Act means that all public money should be spent with the needs of well-being and future generations in mind. And this is how to do it. Thank you very much. Diolch.
David, thank you for that. It was really fascinating, and there are questions we'll be coming back to that have come out of that presentation at the end of the last presentation. I think what I'd like to do is move seamlessly on from Wales to Denmark and introduce Tina Saaby. Tina Saaby is the city architect for Gladsaxe, and for 10 years was the chief architect of Copenhagen. She is also a member of the Academy of Urbanism and practices in her own right. So, Tina, over to you.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me? Yes. I will try to talk about creating living cities from a little bit different point. My experience in general. My experience in general come from being a practitioner in my own office in something called Vitras Architects, and then for the last 10 years, from 2010, I was the city architect in Copenhagen, and now I'm the city architect in Gladsaxe, a part of Greater Copenhagen. Just to say that my experience comes both from being a practitioner, but also from being working in the public sector. To go directly into some of the learnings that I have done being the city architect in Copenhagen and Gladsaxe is the whole focusing on when we create living spaces and living cities, we start to put people first. And that whole idea of putting people first is the generator of how we will create living cities in general. And we try to have this focus on people and talk about urban life before we start to talk about the different designs of urban space and of the buildings. When we look at this people focusing, it has a huge impact in everything we do. It's so basic in one way because it has to deal with how we get eye contact, how we get our cities and buildings down into a human scale, how we talk about the quality of life, and how we will have inviting cities in general, how we work with trust and invitation. So in a way, it's very basic, but also very, very complicated, and we need to put it on a very strategic level. In the city of Copenhagen, we did a strategic paper, Co-Create Copenhagen, and we did an architecture policy that goes directly into this thinking of the co-creation and the thinking of human beings as the main element in creating living cities. And we have a lot of goals, and I could comment on so much of what David was talking about, but I just try to take out one of those goals to talk about creating living cities. And that one goal is to get people outside, and very precisely to get people to stay outside 20% more from 2015 to 2025. It means when we work as designers and architects, urban planners, we need to get people out. And we can do that in a lot of different ways. And I will go through some of these ways that we can talk about design for people. Transit. We need to focus on how we move in the city by foot or bike. We need to design and talk about how we can get shortcuts so that people prefer taking the bike and go by foot instead of taking the car. So shortcuts is an issue. It's also about every time we're designing a building, we need to talk about how can we create it as a passage for people by foot or by bike. Try to invite people instead of having gated communities. So always design bike lines and pedestrian areas when we do design our buildings. Think about how we can get this transit and get people to move by foot or bike. When we talk about getting outside, it's also about how to stay, recreation, to make destinations around the city or in the neighborhood that we are planning, but also to try to look at the close zone to the buildings. This is a public building, and it was nothing without this very small element of creating seatings at the edge zones, but also to try to get a small place to meet at the waterside. To stay is also when we do our working buildings. This is an office building of Novo. There is a big park around it, and this is actually the place where the employees in the building have their meetings. They go out, have a walk and talk, small seatings to have outdoor meetings. So when we design our office building as architects, we have to ask the client, how can we create more meeting spaces outside? To stay is also in our living housing areas, to try to focus on the edge zone. How can we get people outside the building instead of staying inside? Just to take this very small element from our architecture policy, it is saying that we have to focus on the edge zone in everything we are doing. As planners, it means that we have regulation on the edge zones. As architects designing the building, they have to focus on doors and access to public space, and the design of the public space has to be aware of the design of the building. To stay is also to give cultural experiences. This is a music scene that is outside instead of inside, to work with temporarity as a way of getting those issues, cultural experiences. And to stay is also to talk a lot, what David was focusing on, how to get natural experiences. And I could tell a lot about how to work with that in a strategic way that would, in a way, also be a dialogue to what David was saying before. To stay is also to get learning situations. This is apart from our school gardens. So all the schools in Copenhagen have school garden as a part of their learning process outside, to give something back to the living city. This is a schoolyard that is open for public with an access that everybody can go through it, and the kids can also be a part of the city because there is no fencing and no gated area. To stay outside is also to get friends, to meet people. And I know it's difficult in this Corona times, but we just need to get more outdoor spaces so that we can have space enough to be outside, every one of us. And to get friends is also, this is an open school garden with a small glass house where a small startup did a restaurant as a part of the public space. And to do that, when we design our buildings, we also have to be aware of transparency. This is also some elements from our architecture policy. It's important that our facade is transparent so that we can see that life is inside the building and we can get contact and maybe say hello to each other. It's also a part of creating living cities. And to create processes where we will be involved, where we will feel we are part of a community. This is from a project where the kids was also building the urban space. And of course, to spend less CO2. That goes also into something what David was saying. This is an urban space where almost 80% is upcycled materials, because we have a storage for everything that we take down in the city, and then we can use it again next time we are building something. And it is a lot to do with to feel that we are able, when we are outside, that we can feel, use all our senses as a part of creating living cities. Thank you. This is my last slide.
Tina, thank you for that. As a great fan of Copenhagen, it was great to see the slides you had and the approaches you'd taken. I'd like to come back to some points later when we get into questions and answers. And because this is a global small talk, I'm going to move us seamlessly on from Denmark to Singapore. And I'd like to introduce Chani Mun. He's a director at WOHA, a practice in Singapore. And he's really one of these bright young things who's best 40 under 40 and things like that. He also looks at tropical urbanity, which is slightly different from what we've been looking at in Copenhagen and in Wales. So, Chan, I'll pass over to you. That'll be great.
Thank you, Robin. And good morning or good afternoon, everybody from tropical Singapore. WOHA is an architectural practice based out of Singapore, and we've been operating in a developing region with like an explosion of mega cities that threaten to overwhelm the urban infrastructure and its social fabric. This is evident in the rapid urbanization, and this threat on top of the very real threat of global warming. It's instructive of our design strategies in ensuring sustainable best practices in the built environment. A couple of years back, WOHA published a book entitled Garden City, Mega City, and the first half of the book represents a problem statement and the urgent realities of global warming. The second part represents our work, what WOHA's urban and architectural strategies towards a more sustainable future. And in it, we elaborate upon some innovative planning principles that involve layering different programs to achieve a high amenity despite the high density situations we find in the cities in the tropics. We try to give back to the city in terms of greenery and biodiversity. And then we try to open up our buildings to the tropical climate as breathing structures, which consumes less energy. However, we have come to realize that it is simply not enough to have new planning tools or new design tools, and we have to also have a new way to assess, I think, the way we build, new KPIs, if you will. And this will allow us to define and rate our buildings if we want to achieve or drive certain positive outcomes. We have identified 5 key indices, and they are greenery and how it can become an environmental filter and counteract the urban heat island effects and soften the cityscape. We've also looked at the community, how we can foster social interaction in our buildings and developments that we put up, and how we can bring people together instead of isolating them. We've looked at civic generosity, how gregarious our buildings are, how friendly or antisocial are we, good neighbors and such, when we build within the city. We've also looked at the ecosystem as an index, and how we can provide food, water, shelter for wildlife, and how we can promote biodiversity. And lastly, we looked at self-sufficiency. I think in this time and age, it's important that we are able to harvest and to power our own buildings, so how we can move towards net zero energy consumption for buildings. Now, it is also important to WOHA that our ideas do not remain merely as academic theories that we publish in books, but they get translated into built prototypes that test, bait, and pilot these new urban typologies and architectural strategies that we are seeing in our buildings. Today, I'll just show a couple of buildings that can help illustrate, I think, some of these indices that we talked about earlier. And the first one is a hotel and office building, Park Royal and Pickering, that is built in Singapore. The building faces a public park, Hong Lim Park, and the design of the building attempts to mirror the generosity of the park by extending the park vertically up the building. This allows us to achieve an amount of landscaping within the Park Royal that is equal in size to the park opposite it, and which in turn means that we have twice the site area. The amount of greenery is twice the site area. The podium is designed as a landform for landscape with topographical layering of plants, and this continues into the undercroft of the building as a form of visual, to create a form of visual interest and almost like an urban art. This facilitates also good urban connections and allows the rock crop area to be a portal to the city beyond it. The podium, or the roof above, the roof of the podium is then planted, and this is publicly accessible and open to the pub, and it's like it contributes generously in terms of greenery to the urban environment. The facades of the building, the faces of the building, are designed as views for the surrounding neighbors, for the surrounding apartments and public housing that's around it. And the front of the building is layered with multiple layers of gardens and greenery that is, and all these gardens, contribute towards the views and net zero energy proposition for the building. And collectively, this makes the Park Royal a gregarious and generous building that contributes back towards the city. The next building is WOHA. It's actually a hotel, cum office building as well, a mixed-use building in Singapore. And it's actually comprised of multiple layers of what we call breezeway atriums, breathing, living atriums that is elevated in the sky. In this building, it is sheathed or completely cladded in and allows plants to completely populate it. There are over 30 species of plants on the sky terraces and over 20 species of plants again on the facade, which is an attempt to promote biodiversity with a built object within the city. The sky atriums allows the activities of the hotel to spill out into elevated gardens, and this in turn, allows us to multiply the amount of usable public spaces across the entire height of the building. And this is a living tower that is soft, alive, and almost a tropical bouquet or gift to the city. The next prototype is a mixed-use integrated urban village, the Kampung Admiralty project, that is right smack in the middle of the public housing estates in Singapore. The project serves as a model for seniors to actively age in place by bringing together many different stakeholders and programs and people of all ages. It is a building that has the programs stacked one above the other, and within it, each of the programs exists within their own space, and together collectively they enhance, or there's synergies that enhances, I think, the different users across the building. The lowest level is a tropical urban plaza, a sheltered space that the public can come together and interact, and where events, community events can take place. On the upper level is above that is actually a clinic that promotes wellness instead of illness and allows the residents that stays above to very easily access medical care in this building. On the upper levels, stacked above, the childcares and the medical centers is actually a living garden, which forms the backdrop for the residents that stay across it, and also the inhabitants that visit the building. On this garden, there are playgrounds and facilities and amenities that allow the residents to come out and inhabit the spaces. Kampung Admiralty is actually a prototype of an integrated urban village, and it has been proven to be highly successful and well received by residents and public alike. And its focus on community and a holistic approach to wellness has now been used by the Singapore government and replicated across all the mature housing estates in Singapore. And we hope to see a lot more of this very community-centric building being used. I'll just like to conclude by showing some of this dense, built-up research that we've been undertaking, and hopefully this is able to demonstrate together the prototypes that we just looked at, how we can create high amenity, high density spaces that are still highly livable. Thank you.
Jan, thank you so much for that. I've never been to Singapore, whilst I've been to Denmark, I've been to Wales. But with some of the examples you've shown, I think it's something that is worthy of much further study. I sometimes get concerned that when I look at some of the density, or the urban density that's being achieved in certain areas, that we're heading into something like Mega City 1, surrounded by the cursed earth. But what you've got there is just incredible. I'd like to open the questions first to you with the panelists. You've shown us some amazing schemes, but they're all from the before times, before global pandemic. Do you think in the next 5 years, what we've suffered worldwide is going to affect how we look at cities, how we look at urban areas, and how we live? What are your thoughts around that?
Thank you, Robin. I think it's a very interesting question. It's a question that a lot of practitioners are confronted with very suddenly. As we've got clients who are extremely excited and interested in knowing how, the real users are going to be, inhabiting the buildings again. It's like, and I think, to just touch on, I think what Tina was mentioning earlier about getting people outside. We are suddenly in an environment where we are forced inside again. It's like, and suddenly, it's like all these aspirations about vibrancy and creating, all this interesting urban spaces that attract people or bring them out is suddenly, it's like flipped on its head. We think that, at least from what we are experiencing right now, it is an urgent, it is a pertinent question. And certainly in the tropics, it's a lot easier to come up and, say into open spaces and into garden areas and all that, where, so the risk of transmission is a lot less. And it's something that we have already always been espousing. It's like how we can create all these semi-outdoor areas that are shaded from the elements, but at the same time, it's like very easy to occupy and, so people can come up. And I think we will continue to do that. That is a relevant model, and that's something that's that is already being aggressively pushed by by ourselves as well as the policymakers as a means for us to create urban spaces that are less energy intensive, as opposed to occupying air-conditioned buildings, and air-conditioned spaces that, so in the past, all we focused on was the energy aspects of it. But now today, it's like if you're in a sealed space, it is a problem, right? I mean, so we just, so, and I think, if we can start looking at all our urban spaces again and see how we can get, I think we want to get people out again, right? And we're going to do it in a safe and manageable way.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Tina, coming on to questions with you. I could ask you the same question, but I think I'm more interested to see your views around Singapore's response to the density and how it's achieved density and open spaces, and how you think that would contrast or would work in Copenhagen. Any thoughts around that?
I have been in Singapore. So we went there with the politicians to try to learn something about how to work with the urban nature. And we learned quite a lot, because it's amazing the way that you can work with nature, both in the way that it is a part of the street, and that the pedestrian area is often more in a forest or in between the trees than it is just totally concrete. A lot of learnings about green facades, and a lot of learnings about how to make outdoor spaces on top of buildings and in between. But what is totally different is that we don't have the need of building that dense in Copenhagen. So there is a lot of things where you can say it doesn't make sense to talk about high-rise building in that sense, in the context of the amount of people we are and the space we have. So in that, you can say it's not comparable at all. And there is a lot of things that we can't get any learning out of it. Singapore is special because you don't have that much space. So you need to go in the high rise. And I think you do it in a tremendous, beautiful way, because the landscape and nature is such a big part, and also the urban space. And Singapore has been working also strategically with having a public center working with the urban space. So I think that there is a lot of, in that way, also on an organizational way, that we can learn something. But therefore, it's difficult. And the weather in Singapore, it's so easy to get greenery to grow. The weather in Copenhagen is totally different. So in a way, we also have to rethink it when we put it in a Danish context. But I would like also to talk about the COVID and what does it do, because in Denmark we have not been restricted to go out. So we have been out, and the open space, the outdoor space, has been more lively than ever. And it's not only specific places, but it's all around the place. So for me, I would say that to come after the corona will be to do good cities, but just do it better and have more focus on urban space. That would be the future to go.
Okay, thank you, Tina. David, just moving on, we've seen, David, we've seen some really interesting examples from the tropics, from Scandinavia, in terms of how people have dealt with, how people are dealing with cities and the challenges that we're all facing, certainly post-COVID. Do you think there are lessons we can take from what you're pursuing with the Welsh Government around sustainability and around other environmental factors? Are there lessons we can take from that?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think because we've got the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in Wales, then there is a real sense in public bodies, because it applies to public bodies essentially, but even beyond public bodies, that they have to take decisions with the requirements of that act in mind. And you know, the act has 7 goals, many and 47 indicators attached to those goals, and those include the Sustainable Development Goals. Most of those goals are social, and they're about reducing inequality, creating opportunity, making sure nobody gets left out, and that's absolutely vital. But it was originally a Sustainable Development Bill, and it was decided to change its name to the Wellbeing of Future Generations because that was felt to be much more accessible, to be meaningful to people, because when you start thinking about your children and their needs and their children's children and so on, then it becomes much more personal. And in fact, you know, there's a saying which you're probably familiar with, that good decision making is about thinking 7 generations in the future. And attached to the Act is something called the 5 ways of working, which all decision makers in public bodies are supposed to adhere to. And that's about getting out of your silos, breaking down barriers between departments, so you look at decision making in a holistic kind of way, but also thinking long term, and taking account not just when you do a consultation of the views of the consultees, but when you formulate policy, actually trying to reach out, have a conversation with the public about what the policy should be, even before it goes out to consultation. Now, the Act's been in place for about 5 years. There's an independent watchdog called the Future Generations Commissioner, whose job it is to keep an eye on making sure everything works properly. It's currently, the whole Act is currently open to conversation about how to improve it, because it takes a long time for people who've been used to doing things in one way to change to doing things in another way. But I'm pretty confident and hopeful that Wales is very much going in the right direction. And not only that, it's because Wales has only got 3 million population. If you look at, you look at Denmark, you look at Singapore, you look at other countries in the world which have a well-being focus, like New Zealand, it's very interesting, I think, that it's these small countries that are able to take these decisions and move fast.
David, thank you for that. I think it's really interesting that Singapore has a population of about 6 million, Denmark about 5.8, and Yorkshire 6 million. So I think it's, and Wales 3.2. Yeah, so I think there's a very, very valid point. Okay, questions from the audience. Come on, guys, let's hear. I will start running through the ones I'm having coming up on my feed. If there are any others, let's hear them. First question, and this I think is going to be for Chan. What's the policy and practice on air conditioning in Singapore and energy reduction? Because you're a tropical country, what are the issues you have around that?
It's a reality that we've grown up with. So in the past we've got obviously with the advent of technology and that can counter the effects of heat. I think it was embraced wholeheartedly and there was an era where energy was not an issue, where global warming was not an issue. And today, so we've identified that as a serious issue. And from a policy level, at least, in Singapore, they've signed on to the Paris Climate Accords, and and they're very aggressively now trying to address, I think, the efficiency of energy use through mandating it by mandating it through policies and regulations and guidelines. And also, I think it's not just all stick. There are some carrots, of course. It's like and as with all things, it's like there's a a lot of incentive and encouragement for people to for developers at the start to cut down of the design spaces that allows us to inhabit it without necessarily relying on artificial means of cooling. And I think when people suddenly realized, or in time to come, realize that the tropics can be equally as breezy and comfortable outdoors, or or in our sunny outdoor areas without the need for us to artificially cool it, I think that's when the mindset will change. But I think it is really starting to happen, and the policies are already in place to support it.
Okay, right. Thank you for that, Jan. Okay, question now for Tina. Copenhagen's a beautiful city, and over 10 years as city architect, where do you feel you have the greatest influence?
To create living cities. I think that we have had a change in Copenhagen, and already when I applied for the job, the application I was answering were asking a question that they wanted a city architect that could help create living cities. So they wanted a city architect that was not only focusing on designing the buildings, but also was focusing on designing the urban space and the community, to deal with how we can also have a conversation with the citizens about it. So you can say the time before I came was the time also where the leaders and the politicians was focusing on that we need something else. So it's just to say that it was not that it is a movement in Copenhagen. So the application that I was applying for were asking for a discussion about living cities. So I think one of the biggest impact is to always talk about the surrounding areas. So when all the clients came in, I asked them, what does the building give back to the city? And because I have the political mandate, because we have the strategic papers, we have the politicians who said, help us, administration, to get people to stay outside 20% more, and a lot of other very good goals, then it was easy to go and have that negotiation with the clients. And every time we came into to talk about the project, the client was there and the building architect. So it was very easy to say, where is the landscape architect? And they were not, in the beginning, they were not a part of the beginning discussion. So they went home and then they came back again, having also a landscape architect. And that changed the situation, that the landscape architect came from being someone that was putting something on by the end of the process to the landscape architect being in front to start to the discussion about what kind of landscape and urban space do we actually need in this situation. So I think it was also because the scene was there to take it, but I think that was the biggest impact.
Okay, right. A question again from the audience, and this is to the panel. How can you encourage people to spend more time outside when the weather's not on their side, particularly with regard to transport and foot and bike? Any thoughts around that?
Yes. I think if you make it easy for people to walk and bike and make it a little bit complicated to take the car, no matter how bad the weather is, if it takes you longer time to go by car, then you take the bike. And if you have a maintenance in the city that clear the road or the bike lanes and the pedestrian before clearing the car lanes, then it's the access, the invitation for walking and biking is there. And it's the biggest freedom that you can have is that you can go out of the door and transport yourself by foot or by bike. You'll not have anybody that is that can ruin that that freedom, because it's easy to go around. It is always a risk when you're taking the car. Is there a congestion? Is there something that makes it not reliable to get in front? And then when we talk about the urban space, if you have nature enough, nature is so attractive that people will go into it also when it is raining and things like that. So nature, as David was also saying, is a huge element in getting the need for people to go outside. And then of course be aware of having roofs that when it is raining, then you go under the roof, but it's an open roof. Arcade is coming back again into our buildings design, because it's good also when the weather is bad that you are outside but you are in an arcade. So I think there is also very, very clear architectural tools that we can use to help people to go outside.
I think I have a slightly greener alternative as a doer Yorkshireman, which is there's no such thing as the wrong weather, it's the wrong clothes. Okay.
Robin, can I add on to that point as well? I think Tina mentioned about infrastructure, and I think that's relevant, and I think that's something that in this parts of the world, at least in Singapore, it's like we've got a very efficient system. I think that helps to negate the need for us to rely on automobile, and that people generally interact and mix a bit more. The other thing that we find, from my experience at least, that allows people to come out is to create habitable spaces that support those kind of activities. Now, earlier I showed an image of a tropical urban space that's sheltered, so we got this big space with a building hovering above it. That's one model. Of course, the other model could be that we start introducing some of this more semi-outdoor spaces at least in Singapore, where we have to build higher within the building itself. It's like and the breezeway atrias, all this elevated public spaces and all that can allow people to come out again and enjoy nature, and it's like and enjoy, I think, the freedom, it's like of the space that we all strive for or seek.
Yeah. Okay.
I'd like to add 2 more points. One is it's a zoning issue, because we should be making sure that housing is next to schools, next to shops, next to places of work, and not in somewhere else where you need to get in a car. And the other is we should remember the congestion charge in London, which is a great thing to help keep polluting vehicles out of the way.
Yeah, I think we're into discussions there about the 15-minute city, but that will do for another day. One of the questions that's been asked is, do the panel see changes in use from office buildings and commercial buildings into residential? And do we think that's part of a general movement that will make cities more accessible and more livable?
Can you repeat that question, because it was a little bit difficult for you at the beginning?
Yeah. Question from the people watching.
Yeah.
Does the panel think that the change in working patterns because of COVID will mean that more office buildings will revert to residential or alternative uses? And do we think this is a positive thing in respect of city living?
It's a good question. Should I begin to try to answer? And then you can come in. I think that there would be a change, and we can see that already. I guess in the way that the client and the investor is thinking. I don't think it would mean that office building automatically will change into residential building, because the construction of office building is so much different from housing building in general, at least in Denmark, where we don't have housing that only have daylight from one side. I know that's different from UK and Singapore, but I guess that our working patterns will change. So I think that for the local neighborhood, there will be more people at home during workday. So we can see that all the small shops, they are going up right now in income, because people are working home and they go to the butchers instead of being at the big supermarket. So I think that the local neighborhood will have a new chance to bloom, which is an amazing position to start again to talk about placemaking in a more local way. And I guess that is so good. And that means that we as architects and planners really need to grab that and try to push it forward very, very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Well, here in the UK, we've seen the pandemic accelerate a trend that was already happening to do with the internet and people buying on the internet, forcing the close down of shops in the high street. And so there's an increasing number of voids on the high street, which means much less footfall, which means a reduction in exactly what Tina was talking about, which is people having the opportunity to come together and meet each other and have contact. And it's a great tragedy. And it would mean for city authorities to change this and to make these empty shop fronts and hotels in some cases, supermarkets, department stores, to turn them into residential accommodation. They need a change of use, and that's going to take time in the planning system to work through. The reactive nature of the planning system in the UK makes these kind of changes quite slow to operate, but it's something that absolutely has to be done in order to avoid our city centres becoming ghost towns.
I think it's interesting.
Sorry, Robin. Just a few points I want to touch on from the Singaporean experience. We've already recognized pre-COVID that it's like the city, designing the city and residential enclaves and all that means that the city is hollowed out in the evenings and at night, and that actually creates, I think, and the city loses its vibrancy, and that's something that we've always been trying to fix. And pre-COVID, that there was really initiatives and encouraged developers to incorporate housing components even within their commercial buildings, and there's always a mixed-use component that tries to inject population back in the city. Is COVID going to accelerate this trend? Perhaps, because it's like as it is, so we're already seeing developers asking us to think about how we can design homes where people can work in. It's like and so I think it's whether or not that's going to mix well together with this other initiative about building homes within the city itself. It's like injecting cross programmatic users and seeking synergies between them. I think that's probably the trend that we're going to see going forward.
I think it's interesting, building on that, when you look at Boston in America, where if the town centre has lost all its retail outlets, you'd have thought it might have died. But in actual fact, it reinvented itself with artisan bakeries, coffee shops, restaurants. And so it's still a place to go and socialise, where the retail function has been taken out. And the way I see things happening over the next 5 years post-COVID is hopefully more of that, and city centres being more livable. Another question, in terms of where people live, do we think we're going to have to be providing more office space at home? I'm sitting in my living room at the moment, but do we think that's going to affect the design of properties as we see them? Thoughts?
Maybe let me start. Yes, there's definitely it's like a lot more questions about how we can start designing spaces that people can both occupy for their create personal spaces for them, but also a workspace within it that allows them to function as productive members of society. And we've been asked to look at that, and that's coming up even in projects that's almost nearing completion, and we've started to look at how we can add in amenities and resources that allow people to do that. The wonderful thing is that, it's like for the longest time, because in Singapore, apartments tend to be small. And for the longest time, so we've been trying to encourage the use of semi-outdoor spaces, balconies, terraces, and such. And in small apartments, suddenly that's the only space you can get away from the kids. So that's your extra room that suddenly becomes converted into this makeshift office. And we think that, it's like going forward, is that going to be a purpose-built space? hopefully. And is that a space that you can occupy without necessarily turning on your air condition? Definitely. And hopefully that's going to spur a trend where, it's like we start creating more of these special spaces within our homes, and hopefully it's less energy intensive as well.
Yeah, I think you can say there would probably be a lot of different directions that we will go in right now as society, and it will probably also be different from city to city. But if I can hope for something, I will hope that we will be working more diverse, so that we might have 3 days at the office, 2 days at home, or it can be more. It can again be more diverse from person to person, from job to job. I will hope that, because it makes a great effort on life quality that you can choose between that. And then I hope that we will, as architects, be good to say it doesn't mean that we need bigger houses or bigger apartments, but it needs a good local community, so that we might have a place where we can go if the space at home is not good enough, but also where there is a good lunch, or where the coffee is better than the one we make at home. We might be good at take walk and talk. I'm really training myself to put my earplugs in, take my meeting with me outside, go for a walk as a part of it. And it's so easy, but I just need to change my behavior. So my hope is that it actually also means that this tendency to the local neighborhood and to the placemaking indeed will change, so that we can get a better life in general, and get a better balance between our working life and our private life. And I guess that the possibility is there around most of the world, at least.
Okay, I'm going to finish with one question from an aspiring architect, and he's asking what the main environmental goal within these living cities will be, and what will the changes, not next year, but in 10 or 20 years be? What are our global cities going to look like in 20 years' time? What will be the main differences, do we think?
Well, I think we have to move to a circular economy. I think we have to also start to source most of the food that we eat in cities from within the cities, or within the hinterlands of the cities, in order to reduce that ecological footprint. So I think we will see more urban growing. We'll see vertical farms. I know some pioneering work was done quite a while ago in Singapore for urban farms. And only certain kinds of food, though, can be grown in urban farms, in vertical farms. So we're still going to have to import quite a lot of grains and pulses and so on, oils and stuff from outside the cities. But I hope that when we do so, when we process the sewage that results, we will be able to reclaim a lot of the nutrients that are within that, which is valuable stuff. It's a product, and it can be sold back to growers to complete the cycle instead of becoming a problem.
Yep.
I would say the answer is depending on the political leadership in the different cities, because it could also be a tendency that the cities would be more segregated, gated in general. So I think every time I go to a conversation with a person, we have this dialogue between what I want and what the city wants. And if we don't have a political mandate to go and negotiate about that, then it would be driven by a personal feeling. And the personal feeling is more fences, more gating, more not in my backyard thinking. So I think we need a very, very strong political leadership. But if we have that, and if the leadership wants us to go for creating living cities, there is a lot of possibilities. And one thing is sure, and that is that the cities will be more green. There will be more nature in the city, and we can see that from all our 3 presentations.
Okay. Chan, to finish with.
All right, I'll bring us full circle back to, I think, David's talk today. And I think what I hope to see, or what we hope to see, is that, you know, it's like we live in a community or a built environment where we don't live behind a footprint. You know, it's like where, you know, it's like we are able to provide for our own sustenance. We're able to sustain the operations of the environment or the buildings that we inhabit, and we are able to create, I think, vibrant communities that are living together happily. And all these things are driven by policy, of course. And, you know, it's like, and hopefully, you know, it's like we have an environment or or where the people themselves are demanding for such policies, and
right.
that and the government has the mandate and the will to follow through with that.
Okay, Chan, thank you for that. The last hour has gone incredibly quickly. I think we've had three amazing speakers who are really global: Wales, Denmark, Singapore. Thank you all so much for attending. There have been some interesting questions and so many things raised. And so with that, we can't go out for a drink because everywhere's closed. So we'll leave this till next time. But thank you very much for attending, and thank you again for all the presenters. It's been great. Thank you.